What if the greatest betrayal of the 21st century began with a handshake in 1994? In this video, we uncover the truth behind the Russian-Ukrainian war. Not just the headlines, but the broken promises, the shattered trusts, and the tragic cost of peace. The end of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a historic shift, not just for Russia, but for the entire former Soviet bloc. Among the republics that gained independence was Ukraine, a country in the heart of Europe, facing an uncertain future. The post-Soviet era, marked by instability and internal struggles, led to a decision that, today, appears to be a painful gamble on the future. Ukraine chose to give up its nuclear arsenal, one of its last deterrents against external threats. But what does this decision mean today, in light of the dramatic events that have unfolded in the country? A decision that not only marked its history, but also highlighted the vulnerability of a people who believed in a world of peace. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine inherited one of the most powerful nuclear forces in the world. About 1,700 warheads were spread across intercontinental ballistic missiles, strategic bombers, and launch sites. It was an arsenal of incredible power, a daunting legacy that, while a symbol of strength, also represented a terrible responsibility. For Ukraine, a young and fragile nation, this arsenal immediately became both a blessing and a curse. The country, just emerging from the grip of the Soviet regime, was grappling with its national identity, a devastating economic crisis, and the fear of being pulled back into Russia's orbit. Possessing nuclear weapons could seem like a lifeline, a way to protect itself from geopolitical dangers. But the decision to maintain such an arsenal wasn't without risks. The international community, including Russia, disapproved of nuclear proliferation. The constant fear of unchecked escalation or global violence was ever present. Thus, in 1994, Ukraine made a choice to give up its nuclear weapons in exchange for international security guarantees. On December 5, 1994, Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum with the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. In this document, Ukraine pledged to dismantle its nuclear arsenal, while the other signatories promised to respect its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and not use force against it. It was an act of trust, an act that put the security of the Ukrainian people on the line, and was based on the belief in a world where nuclear war was a thing of the past. Ukraine, filled with hope, gave up its nuclear power, believing that the international community would protect its independence. The country dreamed of a peaceful future, free from the shadow of nuclear conflict that had tormented the 20th century. Yet, that promise, the guarantee that was supposed to be the cornerstone of its security, became, over the years, increasingly fragile, until it turned into a mere illusion. In 2014, nearly 20 years after the signing of the Budapest Memorandum, Russia forcefully demonstrated that the promises made held no weight. The annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in Donbass was a blatant betrayal, an act of aggression that violated fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Ukraine, having given up its nuclear weapons in the hope of international protection, found itself alone in the face of Russian fury, a devastating blow, not only on the military front but also on the psychological and moral front for an entire people. The security guarantees, so strongly emphasized, failed to prevent Russia from invading a territory that, on paper, was protected by the international community. Instead of feeling secure, Ukraine saw its sovereignty shattered by violence that seemed unimaginable. Russia, emboldened by its own nuclear arsenal, showed no hesitation in disregarding an international agreement signed by all major nuclear powers. Ukraine, deprived of the deterrent it had voluntarily given up, had no defense. The war in Ukraine, which is still ongoing, is not just an armed conflict. It is the dramatic conclusion of a choice that seemed noble, but has proven catastrophic. For Ukraine, the abandonment of its nuclear arsenal did not lead to a world of peace, but rather exposed it to an unprecedented threat. The absence of a nuclear deterrent left the country vulnerable, while the dream of a world free of nuclear war shattered before the harsh reality of Russian aggression. The conflict has torn at the heart of Ukraine, devastating cities, families, and lives. Thousands of deaths, millions of refugees, and an entire generation living in fear of a future that seems increasingly uncertain. But the true tragedy is not just in the number of victims, but in the realization that all of this, in part, could have been avoided if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons. Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear weapons is a warning that echoes loudly around the world. Today, In an era where conflicts flare up quickly and international alliances are fragile, the issue of nuclear disarmament becomes ever more complex. Ukraine sacrificed its security for the ideal of peace. But this ideal was brutally shattered by the reality of geopolitical violence. Ukraine's story raises a crucial question. In a world still dominated by the geopolitics of great powers, can one truly rely on international promises when national interests are at stake? Political security guarantees, without binding legal obligations, are too weak to protect a nation. In fact, nuclear protection, the fear of global retaliation, seems to be the only language truly heard. Today, Ukraine is more than ever a nation paying a tremendous price for a choice that seemed right, the dream of a world without nuclear weapons. But that dream has, unfortunately, been broken by the reality of geopolitical violence. Ukraine has paid with the blood of thousands, and with the suffering of an entire people who, tragically, have seen the promises made in 1994 shattered. History teaches us that trust in a changing world is never a guarantee of security. Ukraine, in its choice of disarmament, has felt firsthand how fragile the promised peace can be. However, if there is one aspect that must emerge from this tragedy, it is that Ukraine did not betray the agreements, but Russia did. Ukraine, with great courage, chose to disarm, trusting that the international community, and especially Russia, which had signed the Budapest Memorandum alongside the other countries, would honor the commitments made. Yet it was the very country that had promised to ensure Ukraine's security that violated the pact. With the annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, Russia not only broke its promises in the memorandum, but also the foundations of international trust.